Good afternoon. We are going to be particularly entertaining because we're standing between you all and lunch. I am Dr. Bridget Kustin. I join you from the University of Oxford's Said Business School. I'm an economic anthropologist, which makes me something of an outlier at the business school. And the role of economic anthropology in academia is really to understand how if economists view economics as the science of risk and return, an anthropologist views it as a cultural artifact like anything else. Specifically, what I do at the business school is direct what's called the Ownership Project 2.0, Private Capital Owners and Impact. It's a global study of what are called family offices, family holding companies, family foundations, and large family businesses. We set the floor of entities that we study. So the minimum criteria is that there has to be $100 million US in investable assets. That's the floor for us. Right now, the average, based on the interviews we've conducted so far, is much closer to 2 billion. So our research is really focusing on wealth holders at the upper end of the spectrum. We have impact in our title. We do believe that the world is on fire. I don't think anyone in this room is going to disagree with that. And we believe that in order to move the assets of these individuals into solutions that can help address the global challenges of today, that we have to first understand how they work, anthropologically speaking, what galvanizes them into action, and we also have to really understand finance. Now, before I ask our panelists to introduce themselves, a quick poll of those in the audience who please raise your hand if you feel that you could confidently define for a stranger on the street what is meant by private markets. Hi, so I can see them. Okay, I would say that's less than half.
Yeah.
So less than half of the room is not entirely confident what's meant by private markets. And I really think that that's going to be our starting point here, because I'm joined by some extremely accomplished individuals who I think are sympathetic to the aims of this entire conference, but in their day jobs have that wealth holder at the other end of the table as the client. And before I hand it over to them, one more note just on definitions so that we're all on the same page, because I think there's going to be a really useful educational function of this panel about what a family office even is. Anthropologically speaking, business schools are obsessed with efficiency, right? They're obsessed with efficiency, they're obsessed with profits, and in that kind of environment, it is particularly bizarre that there is extreme inefficiency, a complete lack of definitional clarity about what we even mean when we're talking about a family office. If you are one of the big four, you probably set the floor for a family office at 100 million AUM, assets under management. A family office essentially doesn't make much financial sense if a family has less money than that. And a family office, actually, I should say at the outset, is if someone has a lot of investable wealth, they might want to hire their own people to manage that and manage their affairs, as opposed to only having accounts with different service providers. So it speaks to that in-house management of one's estate, essentially. If you are a sovereign wealth fund, if you're an institutional investor, if you're a BlackRock and you want to co-invest with a family office, you likely are not looking at a family office that has assets under management below 750 million US dollars. Now, if you are in Singapore, if you are in Malta, and you want the social or financial benefits or perceived better access to deals that comes with people thinking that you're very rich, you can call yourself a family office and have, $1 million in assets under management. There's no agreed upon definitions. You never really know who you have at the other end of the table when you think you're talking to a family office. So there's a lot of confusion in this space, even among family offices themselves. But with that kind of prefacing note, I want to ask our first speaker, Francesca, to tell us what you do. Tell us about your organization.
Great, thank you so much. Hi, everyone. So my name is Francesca, and I'm part of the University of Zurich. Part of the University of Zurich has a center called the Center for Sustainable Finance and Private Wealth. And basically, we work with the people that Bridget just mentioned, so people whose family wealth is 100 million or more. And they could not have yet received that wealth. They could be inheriting that, or they will inherit that maybe in 50 years, but we work with them at any stage of the journey. And when I say we work with them, we basically educate them. So we have training programs for what we call next generation of wealth holders. We have training programs for family offices. We have trainings also for private bank clients, as well as also wealth managers. So we work basically with all the ecosystem within private wealth, and we educate them on how to have an impact with their capital. Now, we specifically focus on investment rather than philanthropy. So we focus on impact investments, whether they're sort of market rate return or below market rate return, but we explain a bit how to do it, what are the mechanisms we have, we introduce them to others in the ecosystem who know how to do it, and then eventually the idea is that they go ahead and make some positive impact with their investments.
And before we move on, just a quick question on that. Can you give us some sense of how frequently the education and the training does or does not translate into material change in asset allocation? Is the education actually resulting in a change to the money and how that's being allocated and where it's going to?
It's a really great question. I mean, I wouldn't say always it does, but actually, Bridget, there is many people along the ecosystem. So we're an educational provider, and there are other people who help wealth holders to allocate their capital, right? It could be wealth managers, it could be advisors, it could be family office staff. And so often people do end up allocating towards impact, but many might take a year or two or maybe more after our training courses to actually do that, because there are many barriers for a wealth holder to allocate towards impact. Like it's not the sort of like normal route. It's kind of going a bit against the status quo. And then they often face a lot of barriers. So a lot of the work we do is also around like helping them communicate their needs in a kind of formal document that they can give their advisors, which is like, this is what I care about, this is the mission of my wealth, this is what I would like to invest in, this is the types of returns I want, and we call that the impact investment policy statement. And that's a sort of really important document for any wealth holder that actually takes that first step. But yeah, we have some drop-offs along the way.
Those of you interested in this sort of world of wealth managers and the role they play in the ecosystem, I cannot recommend enough one of my favorite books of all time, which is called Capital Without Borders by a sociologist, Brooke Harrington. In order to understand wealth managers, she embarked on the pathway of becoming one and tells you what this world looks like from the inside. Harlin.
Okay, so from the inside. My name's Harlin Singh. I'm the head of sustainable investing for Citi's wealth management business. So I'm responsible for helping our clients navigate how to invest their capital in a way that aligns with their sustainability objectives or their worldview. Our clients can be have anywhere from a $5 million investment portfolio all the way to the family offices that are within the multi-billion-dollar wealth sphere. And the interesting thing about that is that every single client at every different wealth level has a role to play in terms of sustainable development. So my responsibilities include helping our clients navigate, set things like an investment policy statement that reflects their worldview, produce thought leadership that helps our clients understand where there are market failures and funding gaps in which investment capital can play a role, which is different to and often complementary of philanthropic capital. And then also ensure that the investment products or solutions exist where they want to allocate that capital. Also happens to be one of the, I think, barriers when an investor says this is the objective I want to achieve, and then the next step is identifying what the appropriate way to achieve that is. Bridget, you mentioned the difference between private capital and private markets, and public markets. For most of our clients, they are invested in what we call diversified portfolios across public markets, stocks and bonds, and private markets, which tend to be illiquid in nature. And it's our responsibility to advise them in a way around sustainable investing that aligns with their appetite to take the risk associated with different markets and asset classes. I'm sure we'll dig into that a little bit later on. But so my role is very much kind of this intersection between helping an investor think about and define what they're looking from a sustainability standpoint, but also as a wealth manager to ensure that we're maintaining and growing their portfolio in a way that reflects their risk appetite.
I want to state the obvious, which is that the world is in crisis. The rich are getting richer. We know that there is a preference for maximization of returns. This is the whole point of having a diversified portfolio, according to modern portfolio theory. How do you possibly do the work that you do in this environment, right? How does one, are you pushing people towards sustainability? Are you allowing someone to take a vague notion of sustainability and turn that into a change in their asset allocation? Like, practically speaking, when the deck seems so stacked against the work that you do, how do you work in those conditions?
I would say both. For not sounding too vague there, but the reason I say both is, number one, as a chief investment officer, as somebody who's doing research on the macroeconomic environment and where we see value in terms of investing, there are areas in sustainability that we believe will drive investment returns because of their impact, not in spite of their impact. And the reason being, for example, let's look at the energy transition. The investment opportunity in the energy transition is massive, whether that's through efficiency gains, renewable energy, infrastructure. So these are areas we're to quote you, pushing or talking about what the opportunity is. And then the pull piece, really, our clients come from many different perspectives as it relates to sustainability. Most of our clients have a very specific view of something that they want to change, whether that's education systems or healthcare systems. And then it's our responsibility to advise them on how to build a portfolio such that they maintain that diversification. So as an example, an investor or a client who might really care about affordable housing, for example, generally, you can only affect that in private real estate. Private real estate requires you to lock up your capital for many years. So now if you have an emergency and you need that capital, you cannot access it. So that ends up, our advice would be for that to be a very small part of their overall portfolio. And then we help advise them on, okay, why is it that we care about affordable housing, right? What is driving you to care about that? And then thinking about different areas of impact that can exist in more liquid instruments that you can draw on tomorrow if you have an emergency that complement affordable housing, for example.
Great, thank you. Juliet.
Hi everyone, I'm Juliet Agnew. I have a slightly different perspective as the head of philanthropy at Barclays Private Bank and Wealth Management. So clearly I focus more on the philanthropy side of things, but where we cross over and intersect is that we're all working with families and individuals of wealth. In our case at Barclays, that tends to be individuals typically with investable assets of over 5 million. So that's the kind of scale and scope, but often they have a lot more of that. And when it comes to a family office and kind of what we mean by a family office, we don't really define it in terms of the size of capital necessarily, although a lot of people do. What I see and what we see is that family offices are often a kind of constellation of family members plus professional staff, maybe, plus consultants, maybe, and they define themselves in slightly different ways. So one of the complexities is kind of who are we engaging with when we say the family office. In my case, it is often the principal, so that might be the first generation that generated the wealth, the entrepreneurs. It might also be the next generation or the whole family together, and sometimes also people like the chief investment officer or the chief of staff. But clearly all of these individuals have different values, different views, different perspectives. The key for me, just in terms of what I'm doing, so you know what it is that we do, my background is in philanthropy and social impact. So I have a mission, I have a real mission that I am all about trying to help our clients to unlock more and better philanthropy into good causes. So this is about impact, but it's also about making sure that they're having a rewarding experience with their giving. Why? That is important because they're not going to do more of it unless they're having a rewarding experience with it. So it is impact for them as well as impact for the world. There is a very interesting thing, I think, about being a philanthropy and social impact professional within a wealth management industry, as I'm sure you can imagine. Offers a lot of opportunity, also a lot of challenge, I think. But I'm very clear, when we talk about unlocking capital, what does that actually mean? For me, that doesn't happen at a kind of a vague institutional level. It happens at the individual level. So how I'm working and what I'm trying to do is to work at the individual level with individual wealth holders. So the people that generated the wealth, that might be the patriarch or the matriarch, or it might be the next generation, to help them understand what is possible with philanthropy first and foremost, because there's often a misunderstanding actually about what philanthropy is and what it's for and how it can operate at its best. So really educating people on that opportunity. A key part of it for me is inspiring. So we want to keep this focused on what's practically possible in the world and exposing clients to lots of diverse examples of what good philanthropy can look like in the world and how they might be able to replicate or learn from that. And then the third part is connection. So one of the key barriers, as I see it, to capital really being unlocked and then philanthropy deployed in effective ways towards impact is the disconnection and siloed thinking and the isolation that can happen when individuals try to do this on their own and they get stuck in their own heads. So we try to connect them as early as possible with the broader ecosystem of impact. So that requires us to really take the time to listen to them first, to understand where they are on their journey, what their interests are, what their values are, where they are on their learning journey as well. How experienced are they? What are the biases and perspectives that they have? So that we can orient them quite quickly and figure out what it is that they need in terms of community learning, all of that kind of thing, to accelerate them towards impact. I'll pause there.
So as an anthropologist, I'm a professional party crasher, inviting myself into the homes, businesses of families, their annual general meetings, service provider events. I was at one service provider event for clients, and the topic was philanthropy. And the speaker started off by saying, the first thing that you have to do is decide if you want your philanthropy to generate returns, or how much tax or if you want to approach it essentially primarily for tax minimization, or if you want it to, create some impact in the world. I was surprised to hear this. The notion that philanthropy at the outset could be thought of as a returns-generating vehicle itself was a shock to me. Can you comment about what it's like to be a philanthropy professional when, in this jurisdiction, philanthropy is a tax minimization strategy, right? Like these financial implications of philanthropy can also not be disassociated from the good intent and the good works of it, right?
Yeah, I think that's one of the main criticisms of philanthropy, isn't it, that exists out there, and I can see where people come from with that criticism. Personally, I don't tend to see people coming to philanthropy because they're motivated by tax. I think that tax is one part of a decision around timing of liquidity of assets and kind of organizing finances that leads on to a question about structures and all of that kind of thing. But it's just one honestly quite small dimension. I really have never met anyone that is a kind of interested, engaged philanthropist who's motivated by tax. It's not very motivating, quite frankly. And also you don't get richer, even though there are tax efficiencies, you never get richer by giving money away. So I think that's a pretty weak argument, and it doesn't really reflect the reality that I see. I do think that we have a way to go within the wealth industry generally about moving beyond conversations about tax and structuring when it comes to philanthropy. And that can be sometimes where the conversation starts in the wealth management industry, and we have to get beyond that. And for me, the power really is in igniting passion around purpose, values, and the stuff for me that's really interesting about family offices and families of wealth, particularly at that level of wealth, is when I go in and I say to these family members, what is the thing that gets you up in the morning and what is the thing that keeps you up at night? Almost always, the second point, what is it that keeps you up at night, is worrying about the children, actually, and worrying about the next generation and how they are going to move successfully in the world as stewards of wealth. So they may not be coming at purpose and philanthropy as a primary concern, but I can work with that. I know I can work with that, because actually the conclusion we often get to quite quickly when you unpick that is that leaving vast sums of money to your children without really giving them the skills and equipment to cope with it And even if you do, quite frankly, will often lead to something very, very unhelpful for your children and for the world. So we work with those kinds of conversations.
Now, hats off to Vicky and Ashanti for including this panel in the day, because I think within the really important critique of wealth inequality that is shared by us in the room, there's also the question of what to do with all of the liquid assets that are currently sloshing around the world, that currently exist, right? We can critique the systems that have created this. That does not undo the opportunity to ask, now that there is this accumulation of unequal wealth in a small number of hands, what do we do with that? One of my surprises in working on this research project is I get 1 to 3 inquiries a week, random inquiries from the general public all over the world that has some kind of venture, and their question is, how do I access family offices? I need funding, I can't get it from a commercial lender, my project is too risky, it's too specific, it doesn't fit into their actuarial risk calculations. I believe that the only person who can actually fund my venture on terms that do not put me under exorbitant debt are families, right? So starting from that sort of supply problem, Harlin, can you walk us through some of the opportunities that exist, concrete products, vehicles for getting money into the hands of, so I'm talking now about direct investments, right? Not the public markets, but the opportunity for families to be investors in game-changing small, medium, large operations, because conventional sources of financing aren't coming through. What's the opportunity?
Yeah, so there's and it's interesting because you asked the question earlier about this philanthropy creating returns, right? I think what's really interesting is the innovation in financial markets where investment structures can be philanthropic-like, meaning they either are illiquid for longer periods of time than you would expect. So investing directly in a company or investing into a private equity fund, generally you're expecting to lock up your capital for 10 years to 12 years, right? That is the kind of the industry norm in terms of liquidity structure. With family offices, what they do have is patient capital. So what they could potentially do with some of these companies is lock up their capital for even longer, which makes it not market rate from the perspective of the illiquidity premium that would be required for it. They can also lend to a company at a lower cost than prevailing market rate debt would imply. And that offers a company that's operating in a region or testing new models for addressing a certain problem to borrow access capital that may otherwise not be available to them, or access capital in a way that's more functional from a debt servicing or the ability to repay that debt standpoint. But I think, and then there are also investment vehicles now that combine philanthropic capital and investment capital. So whereby, say it's a company or a fund that's investing in companies that are addressing water, access to water in sub-Saharan Africa. That fund might not appeal to the vast majority of investors because it seems risky. It's in a region that they're not used to and they don't know how to assign that risk level. And a philanthropist could come in and say, I'll take the first 20% loss of these companies in the event something goes wrong, thereby making the investor feel a little bit more secure putting that capital to work. And a family office can actually exist both as the philanthropist or as the market rate investment partner for that. So I think that the evolution in financial markets is very interesting. There used to be a time, when I started in this space where impact investing and sustainable investing and the head of philanthropy would sit on opposite sides of the floor. And we would say, this is not philanthropy. And the philanthropic advisory team would say, this is not investing. And now, there's an opportunity to coexist in a way to maximize impact, knowing the roles of different types of capital in that.
The notion that a family can essentially collaborate with itself.
Correct.
Right?
And we're seeing that happen.
Is novel. That was going to be my next question, is that, so to give a name to what you described, blended financing, catalytic capital, these kinds of new products, how often are they being used, right? It's great that they exist, but are you actually seeing clients going for them?
Increasingly, yes. It's still slow to move. I think that still there, so when you look at a family office and a family office structure, often with our largest family offices, they also have a family foundation, and the head of the foundation and the CIO, the chief investment officer, don't talk to one another. Also, the other person that doesn't talk to them is the person running their business. So the person running the operating business that generated that wealth. And now what we're starting to see is a bit of a shift in that, where the principal is saying, well, I want to address this problem. I can address this problem first and foremost by my operating business, right? Where my supply chains are coming from, how I'm thinking about my own emissions, et cetera, through the operating business, through my philanthropic activity and through my investment capital, and they're forcing them to talk to one another. We talked a little bit about the generational shifts over the course of the day in a family. Those generational shifts are also happening in the family office executives, right? Where the CIOs are retiring and there's a new generation coming in.
Case in point, I guess, the people on the stage, really.
But that's really important, right? Because, I started my career in sales and trading in very traditional, banking products. Most people who I've worked with over the course of the last 2.5 decades would never think about philanthropy, actually, or addressing real world issues through investments. And that's starting to change quite significantly. So the innovation is happening. We work very closely with also the large world organizations. So think about the multi-development banks, such as the World Bank, on structures in which they're bringing together NGOs and investment capital to address things like biodiversity loss. So I can give you another example there. We worked on a project in South Africa on increasing the population of the black rhino. Great project. It was in partnership with 2 NGOs, and it was in the format of an investment. It was a bond, right? So the World Bank borrowed money in which they owe the investor the principal back at the end of 5 years, plus a coupon or an interest payment. That interest payment, instead of going to the investor, went towards this conservation effort. And if successful, the investor got a better than market rate return. And guess what? We're 2 years into the project and we've already blown through the expected rhino population increase. So the project was incredibly successful and the investors get to participate in this. These types of structures did not exist prior to 2 years ago. So it's growing.
Now, in light of that kind of innovation, Francesca, the Center for Sustainable Private Wealth really got its start in impact investing. In light of this kind of innovation, is impact investing passé? Is it too evolving? Where do we fit impact investing within this new suite of offerings?
Yeah, so impact investing is also defined by different people as different things, but we usually talk about capital which is having a real impact on the world, and that's usually private markets, so like venture capital, private equity, investing in small companies that are having a positive impact, and that capital enables that company to have more of that impact. So we're not talking about investing in like Microsoft or whatever, we're talking about like small companies, privately owned. I think there's been a whole shift in impact investing over the last couple of years. What I see is, so we've been, at the CSP, we've been running training programs for wealth owners for 10 years, and the curriculum has changed so much in that time, so I'm responsible for doing the curriculum. And every year I'm having to add more sessions about cool like structures that Harlin just mentioned, or like interesting ideas, because people are asking for more, and they're like, okay, I like the course, but could it be more progressive, or could it be more like, could we talk more about interesting structures? And just to give you an example, 2 weeks ago I was running a course for family offices, and I had about 15 family offices, and it was a kind of peer-to-peer sharing. So they're all sharing, so we had a few expert family officers that have done a lot of really cool impact investments, talking to others in sort of Chatham House rules, like, oh, this is what I do, like kind of really informal setting. And I thought, let me like push the boundaries a bit. So we invited someone from a family office who has a project called the Enough Project. And what he does is he says, well, I work with wealth holders to figure out what's their enough number, like how much money is enough? Like, and it almost doesn't matter what the number is, but just like that exercise of being like, oh, I think, 200 million is enough. Like, people are laughing, right? But like, that's even quite radical. Like, that's even like quite, and someone in the audience there had about 850 million, and he was really challenged by this speaker asking him to think about how much might be enough. And he says, I feel like I'm stealing from future generations. I feel like I'm really... But then after a couple of days of this training course, people came up and they were like, I'd like to know more about the Enough Project. I'd like to know more about how much how I can identify how much is enough for me and my family. And like these are some concepts that are sort of entering into impact investment, that are really new and really, really interesting. And similarly, another interesting concept is people used to take their money and go, right, I'm going to give 5% to impact investment. Traditionally, that is quite a common approach. It's called a carve-out, or 2%, some percentage. And now we work with people that are like, I actually want to do 100% of my portfolio, and I want to do it across asset classes. So I have some real estate. I want that to be impacting social housing or homelessness. I've got some private markets. I want to be that working in emerging economies. I've got some really big companies like public markets like Microsoft, and I want to use my voice as an owner to ask them to do better. We call that active ownership or engagement. So there's lots of different techniques, and I see more and more families that would be like, all right, I just want to do 100% impact with all my portfolio. How can I do that? Then they face challenges along the way. It's not that easy, right? There are opportunities, they're difficult to find funds, difficult to find advisors, but that is really interesting, and that's the thing I'm most excited about when people come to me and they're like, I want to move 100% of my assets towards impact. It might take 10 years, it might take longer, but going towards that direction is quite new as well.
Can you give us some kind of benchmark of how frequently that happens? Right, and I'm saying this because this kind of space is characterized by so much aspiration, optimism, and hope. I actually think that there's a surfeit of optimism. Whenever I talk to a relationship manager, the actual numbers are inevitably bring me right back down to earth.
Yeah, I mean, I'm lucky enough because people that come to me have already paid quite a lot to be on the training program when teaching them about this topic. So I'm only seeing like a slither of the community. But I also work with wealth managers. So I work with large banks, and I train their relationship managers. And I recently did a training in Singapore and Hong Kong where I had about 150 relationship managers, training them for 2 whole days on this topic. And I must say, it was a bit of a wake-up call. I was like, oh, okay. Like someone said, I said, are you getting some demand from your clients about impact investing, some of your younger clients? And someone was like, oh, yeah, well, I'm not sure. And someone said, yeah, actually, one of my younger clients came into my office the other day and asked about this. And then they talked about the client's 65. Okay, so it's taken quite a while for this change to happen. But yeah, I do think that there's more and more of them, but I mean, yeah, a lot of people still want to make as much money as possible and care about impact.
Now, in the framing document for this conference, there was a line in bold that said, we recognize that philanthropy is not social justice. There are other panels today that are about decolonial thinking and distributing forms of power. Are you hearing this from the families that you work with? Is this starting to percolate down into wealth holders themselves? Because another kind of constant theme in spaces like this is of 2 ships passing in the night, where civil society and activists have a very clear diagnosis of what the problem is and what it takes to solve it. Wealth holders are not living in that world, right? But they're the ones who have the capital. So, with reference to the previous session, can we organize wealth holders? I think it's to our own detriment to really not be very carefully attentive to what the state of play is right now, and specifically what the blockages are. So are these messages reaching wealth holders? What do you think the blockages are to philanthropy being done in a way that would be broadly approved by the attendance of this conference?
It's a big question. The less optimistic side is it's quite rare for me to meet a donor at the relatively early stages of their journey who is asking me about social justice or is even really aware of what that means. But the other side of it is we are seeing more next gen, much more conscious of these topics, even if they haven't been involved in philanthropy or impact investing before. For some reason, the younger generations, well, I think we can understand why in some ways they're more plugged in and exposed to the challenging topics of our time, like climate. They understand the complexity of these situations, and they feel more compelled to want to address them. And I know that anecdotally. I don't have statistics, but I also know it because we've started to run next-gen education programs, of which philanthropy, sustainable investing, and impact are a significant part. And when we asked these participants beforehand if they had the time, money, ability to address a complex social challenge now, what would it be? Or would you want to do anything about a particular topic? And they all say yes, climate is the primary one. So I think there is a kind of baked in, at least a degree of an understanding that there are pressing, urgent needs in the world that require collaboration across multiple sectors, and that they possibly have an important role to play. And we're trying to help them to understand and sort of build that sense of agency within them to be able to take action. Because one of the challenges in a family dynamic, in a family office, wealthy family dynamic, as you can imagine, is you often have quite a sort of powerful patriarch or matriarch that can sometimes suck the air out of the room, and you have this next generation grappling with what role do I possibly have to play here. So part of our role is to help empower them and give them the skills and a sense of agency that they can do something. So that can be a bit of a blocker, but there's an opportunity there. I think some of the other blockers, so I've worked in this space of philanthropy for a long time, and I used to find it, I still do find it very frustrating sometimes that we seem to we talk about these issues, they get called different things, trust-based philanthropy, social justice, all these things. They're not entirely new concepts, quite frankly, but they get repackaged and repurposed, and we wonder why we're not making changes and why we're not moving on these things. So I try to go beyond the jargon with clients because I don't think the jargon is particularly helpful. And I try to get through to what I think is the more important thing when it comes to philanthropy, which is the mindset that they have. It's really about trying to get them to understand sometimes that philanthropy, well, oftentimes actually, the skills that made them successful in the business and commercial world and the mindset that got them there is possibly quite different from what they're going to need to be successful or effective, move the needle on a complex issue as a philanthropist, for example. We need collaboration, we need a relinquishing of control, and when you've built a business, you tend to want to micromanage and control everything. These are kind of different skill sets and different mindsets. We need an openness, we need a curiosity and a sort of a desire to collaborate and connect across different sectors. So for me, that's probably the biggest blocker. One is understanding what's possible and going beyond the jargon to help our clients understand what is actually possible. What does it mean to be effective in philanthropy, and trying to bring some of the principles of social justice and systems change thinking into that, but without using the jargon. It's quite challenging, to be fair. And then helping them with the mindset piece and holding a mirror up and really trying to get them to think about whether they need to shift their mindset.
So please do visit the websites of the Center for Sustainable Private Wealth, the Ownership Project. We both conduct research. We both have toolkits and resources for wealth holders. And the utility of those documents for non-wealth holders is to understand how we position our insights to speak to a very particular demographic, not just to meet them where they're at, but literally to speak in their grammar so that they understand arguments as being resonant for them, really to address this two ships in the night problem. I think that, if I may kind of speak to all of you, and please challenge me on this during the break, I think that there is some scope for those who work in civil society and in activist organizations, not to in any way pander, but to ensure that they are speaking a language that can be heard and engaged by wealth holders. I would say that is sort of takeaway number one. Takeaway number two, I was trained by Marxists in graduate school, right? I came to this work very critically, and I still am very critical of it. The challenge that I got that was really a game changer for me was someone talking about fusion technology meant to replace internal combustion engines. And they pointed out that, technology like that, given the amount of time and the amount of money it's going to take, you're really only looking at governments or you're looking at families. And right now, there are some families who are putting serious money and serious time into fusion technologies when certain governments are slow to move their feet. I don't yet have a rejoinder, right? One thing that I do struggle with is good actors on one end are they outweighed by the bad actors on the other, right? For every fusion technology family, we have a Trump family, right? Like what kind of math does this result in, in terms of what it means for us to then come down on what we say about family offices? Any closing reflections on that broad theme of what the utility of this panel is for the audience? And
just one quick thing on what you just said. On one hand, you have one family. On the other hand, you have another family. I think the biggest problem that we have is a language problem. Because I don't think anyone's rooting for the downfall of society. And anyone's, like, if you look at, like, Texas and some of the red states, and you look at where the U.S.'s Inflation Reduction Act spending has gone, half of it has gone to red states, right? So I think that there's a huge barrier, and I think that as an industry, as an ecosystem, we often leave people out because of the language versus breaking down some of these silos. So I think we also need to kind of, I'll be self-critical here, get out of our own echo chambers and really speak to, to your point around using real words. I mean, it's so incredibly important because I think the jargon is what is polarizing people.
Francesca, Juliet, any closing reflections on the utility of this panel for the audience?
I would just say, but like you said, like family offices have so much power because they're the only really large investors that can do whatever they like with their money. Like pension funds, insurance companies, to some extent governments, they're bound by rules and regulations. And family offices is the only pot of capital that can do whatever it wants. And I think that's really powerful. And collectively, they manage about 10 trillion, which is just like so much money. It's like 2 or 3 times like the UK's GDP. Like it's a lot of money that can look very far ahead, take a lot of risk if it wants to, if it's convinced. And there's quite a lot of demand from what I'm seeing to have an impact with that. So I kind of see that. That's why I moved into private wealth. That's why I started this job at the CSP, because I really felt like that was a real like untapped pool of capital that could be really useful.
Juliet?
Yeah, for me, I think it just goes back to the same point about points of connection across the ecosystem. We're obviously in a very privileged world and have very privileged access to families of wealth. When accessing those families, credibility and trust is key, and rightly or wrongly, they will often look to their wealth managers, people in our kinds of institutions first for advice. So we have quite a lot of responsibility there, but I also feel like as part of that responsibility, we need to be connecting across the ecosystem and making sure that we are aligned, even in our different worlds, on what is the possibility with philanthropy with impact, where's our North Star, where are we trying to get to? And I think listening to each other and learning from each other, from us being here today, I feel like is really important for us to hear from you, from you to hear from us. I think that it can be a little bit depressing sometimes working in this space, but I also think that there is a lot of opportunity.
Please join me in thanking our panelists.